So I'm Stephen. As Brian, you said, I'm the co-founder of Positive Planet. I've spent approximately the last 10 years working within sort of renewable energy sector and with various what you might call decarbonisation consultancies. So I've been working with businesses of all sizes, helping them reduce their carbon footprint and their climate impact. I started Positive Planet with Adam earlier on this year because we wanted to make a positive difference, and we felt that there was insufficient support and help available for small to medium-sized businesses. So that's what we specialise in. We do work with some larger organisations, but typically it's small businesses, anything from one-man band startups up to medium-sized manufacturing, engineering type businesses and everything in between. I am imperfect. I occasionally forget to take my bag for life to the shops, and I think this is one of the sort of challenges with climate change and acting on it sometimes, is that people feel that I have to make a wholesale change and do everything rather than it being iterative change. And it is very much about just doing something and taking some small steps and not worrying about doing it perfectly. And hopefully you'll see that as we go through the slides. Got a little delay on the slide change, I think. There we go. So Positive Planet, we are a profit with purpose business, as Brian said, and that enables us to actually reach out to more people. So the fact that we make money means that we use that in our marketing activity to promote our business. So it's beneficial in our actions, and that was a conscious decision that we made in setting up the business. We work with organisations of all sizes, and we help them understand their carbon emissions and how to reduce them, and in some cases how to communicate them with their wider stakeholders as well. We are changing the way businesses engage with sustainability. We make our services simple to use. We use a lot of technology to simplify that process, and we make them accessible and affordable as well by utilising technology to simplify what we do. We are committed to doing the right thing by the planet. We're proud to play our part in that effort to try and save our planet and help others do that as well. We're working towards being a net zero company in the next 18 months. So as you can imagine, we've gone through a lot of action to try and reduce our carbon footprint. So, you know, we walk in our own shoes, if you like, and we've done everything from looking at sustainable offices to moving to sustainable banking, to even things like being on sustainable web hosting. So every little thing that we can do, and we still have a carbon footprint of about 2 tons per employee. Now, the average office-based business is probably around about 3 tons per employee. So it's been hard work to get that ton per employee removed. But there's just that last few that we can't yet remove because of things like contractual obligations, because we're tied in with things like vehicles, etc., and because we just do sometimes have to travel and certain things have unavoidable emissions. So we aren't perfect. We are working towards trying to get to that point, but we think it's probably going to take us about 18 months to get there. As you can see at the bottom of the screen, we are a member of a number of organisations, and this might be something that you want to consider in your business. By being part of those organisations, it does help open up access to additional help, support, contact with other organisations, etc. So they're things that you might want to consider. And if that's something that you want to talk to us about, some of those are really easy. They're just a question of signing up. Others are a little bit more work, and you have to demonstrate evidence of what you're doing. But if they were things that you're considering, we're happy to have those conversations with you and your organisation about which of those might be appropriate for you. So the agenda for today, we're going to talk you through the meaning of net zero, because as Brian mentioned earlier, there are a lot of confusing terms, and I do keep seeing new ones come out and people creating new definitions. But we're going to go through the main ones and just help you to understand those and what they mean to you and your business. We're going to help you to understand some of the risks and opportunities, and I suppose some of the barriers associated with net zero for small to medium-sized businesses. And we're also going to look at some of the actions you can take to be a more environmentally sustainable business as well. So what is net zero? Well, there's 2 definitions really. There is, and I didn't really know the right term for this, but I suppose a global definition that governments use when they talk about it, that some of the non-government organisations that are supporting climate action will talk about. But Essentially, we reach global net zero when the amount of harmful greenhouse gas, which we'll refer to today as carbon or CO2 emissions, we add is no more than the amount taken away. So this means that, if we put out 1 ton of carbon, the Earth is capable of removing that ton of carbon as well. And at the minute, we are pumping out more carbon than the Earth is capable of sequestering, and we are removing our sequestration capabilities as well, and sometimes at quite an alarming rate. From a business perspective rather, the definition is slightly different, and a net zero business is one that has minimized its carbon footprint and has got that to a point where they can't really do any more. We're not quite there because we know there's things that we can still do. And it means that you're offsetting your residual final hard to remove emissions. So for us, we offset those final 2 tons per employee, and we do that through a mix of purchasing carbon offsets, carbon credits, and tree planting. And we'll talk a little bit about those later on. There's recently just been published by an organisation called the Science Based Targets Initiative, and they have set what they call a corporate net zero standard, which applies to any business, which to become net zero means that you have achieved 90% decarbonisation by 2050. Now, we work with quite a lot of organisations who are trying to do that more quickly, and we typically try and get an organisation to being net zero somewhere around about 2030 is achievable for a lot of businesses at the minute. And to do that, means removing scope 1 and 2 emissions, which we'll talk to you about later, and then probably halving the scope 3 emissions as it currently stands. And that's reasonably achievable for most businesses within a 10-year time frame, unless you have very complex supply chains that you have little control over. So how does net zero differ from some of those other terms that you're hearing, like carbon neutral, carbon negative, and zero emissions? Well, carbon neutral is a position where you are balancing your carbon emissions by offsetting your CO2, your carbon emissions, with either carbon credits or nature-based solutions such as tree planting. And again, we'll talk to you a little bit about carbon credits, tree planting solutions later on. They are an effective way of offsetting your emissions, but done in the right way. And we only use those with businesses that are working towards reducing their carbon footprint. We don't see them as a solution in isolation that you can just, I suppose, greenwash or absolve yourself of the responsibility of trying to reduce your emissions. So we use them as an interim measure, and then as a last piece of action where you can't remove your emissions. So they're done in conjunction with a carbon reduction plan. Carbon negative is a slightly different term, and that's a position where we are sequestering more CO2 from the atmosphere than is emitted. And this might be done with new technologies such as carbon capture. So if you've seen any of these, they basically look like giant air conditioning systems. They suck carbon out the atmosphere and then they store that carbon. And they're becoming an increasingly popular solution. And certainly some of the big businesses like Microsoft are investing heavily in this technology as a means of trying to get their businesses to being what they might term as climate positive, which means they are taking more carbon out the atmosphere than they actually put back in. So that's carbon negative. You may hear sort of carbon or climate positive used in conjunction with that term. Net zero we talked about, and that's the point where you've minimized your carbon footprint and are offsetting the final residual hard to remove emissions in your business. And then the final one is one that's often associated with products. You might see it sometimes on cars. And it refers to a process where no CO2 emissions are released, and you've got technology which produces zero emissions. And it's very difficult, and sometimes I find that there's a sort of, some of these claims are a little bit spurious. You know, if you talk about a car being zero emissions, the manufacturing process has emissions inherent in that process, and that's part of the carbon footprinting process that we look at, is an entire footprint rather than just something in isolation. So how do you go about removing carbon? Well, pretty much everything we do and make or anything we purchase has a carbon footprint. So in our business, there's a lot of different actions that are measured that have a carbon footprint. And even sending an email has somewhere between about 3 and 6 grams of carbon, depending on who you use and the size of the email. So it's really hard to get away from having some sort of carbon footprint and some sort of carbon impact, but it's about how we go about then reducing that. The average adult in the UK has a carbon footprint of about 11 tonnes of CO2 per annum, and the picture there shows you what a tonne of carbon actually looks like, and it's probably about the size of an average sort of modest 3-bedroom semi-detached house. So if you can think about that and contextualize that, it's 10 houses in the average street is about the size of your annual carbon emissions, and it's pretty frightening, I think, when you start to visualize it in that context and see just actually how much we are all responsible for and emitting. If you look at then that on a global basis, the carbon footprint in the US is approximately twice ours. In Australia, it's about 3 times the size. In countries like India, it's nearly half of our carbon footprint on a per capita basis. And I think the lowest countries in the world are at about 4 tonnes average per person across the globe. So we need to get ours down below 4 tonnes is where the target is for the UK. And ideally getting it to a point where we've pretty much zeroed out on that and we've all got virtually no CO2 emissions. How do we get rid of it? Well, reduction, actually stopping doing things, changing the way we do things is the best overall solution. So not emitting carbon in the first place is the best thing you can do. New technology is making some of that easier. So in terms of vehicles, electric vehicles have a much lower carbon footprint than internal combustion driven vehicles, so petrol and diesel. If you look at then things like energy, your carbon footprint with renewable energy is significantly reduced, and we've got a case study later where you'll see one of our clients they're an office-based business. They have about 5 tonnes of carbon emissions associated to their energy use, but actually because they switch to green energy, that becomes zero emissions effective from that their energy consumption in the business. Once you've then started to reduce your own emissions and change your behaviours, then it's about offsetting through either carbon credits, nature-based solutions, or I think in the future we'll see a lot more in the way of carbon capture being a solution that we use as well. So we come across, I suppose, 4 different reasons why people don't go about reducing their carbon footprint, and they tend to boil down to about 3 things really. One is that people perceive that there's quite a high cost associated with the activity, and there's certainly, if you look in the press, there's often claims that the cost of understanding your carbon footprint and going through the process of reducing that can be quite significant and run into thousands of pounds. And in some cases, people perceive it as being a cost that doesn't derive any benefit for them. And that's not really the case. And what we see from businesses that undertake the carbon footprint is often one of understanding where they can make cost savings within the business as well. So it's often about efficiencies, how you do things better, how you reduce cost, maybe looking at investment that will reduce cost over time and things like on-site renewable energy. And how do you do things just generally more effectively? Sometimes things like commuting, cycle to work schemes can reduce cost for your staff. It's those type of things that don't necessarily have to mean increased cost in the business. For most small businesses, the cost of measuring, understanding and starting to take action to reduce your carbon footprint runs into low-level hundreds of pounds rather than it being thousands of pounds. So there are organisations like us that do it affordably for businesses, and there are also some free tools. And if you start to look around, and we'll signpost you to some of those. There are a lot of free resources available, sometimes through some of the things like the Climate Hub and some of the organisations that you can sign up to. We'll give you a lot of information. I know we're part of Federation of Small Business. They're doing quite a lot of work at the minute on helping small businesses access information around climate change and giving you simple tips, pointers on what you can do. It's hard to get away from some of that at the moment, especially with COP going on. I think that over the next few weeks, you're going to see a lot about climate change, a lot of advice, a lot of help. So there is a lot of information out there, a lot of support, and it doesn't have to be a cost-driven activity for your business if you want to try and manage that and keep that down. Time for a lot of organisations is another challenge, and I think that, we understand the challenges of running a business, and it's difficult to sometimes find that time to think about something that isn't core to your business. But it's becoming increasingly important, and sustainability is a key factor for a lot of businesses, and it's going to become even more important. We're going to see increasing regulation, increasing pressure on supply chains, increasing pressure from customers. So for businesses that aren't starting to embrace this, I think you're going to find that you come under increasing pressure and increasing challenge to do something. So our advice is about adopting this early, making this something that you just start and make small changes, but starting to understand your carbon footprint and how you can go about reducing that is really important. And as I said earlier, it doesn't have to be a high cost activity, but it doesn't have to be a hugely time consuming activity either. Measuring your own carbon footprint can be challenging. It can be done, and there are tools to help and support you doing that. If you want to get a full view of your carbon footprint, it's often quicker, easier to use a consultancy such as ours to do that. And it also has other benefits in terms of, if you are looking to communicate that externally, that being something that's been verified independently can be quite important. The final challenge typically comes around sort of understanding what to do. And we see a lot of businesses that start off trying to do this themselves, and then they come to us when they've reached a point and say, actually, I've got a bit stuck, and it's starting to get a bit confusing, and it has become more work than I have time for. So there are elements that can be really easy, maybe measuring your carbon emissions associated with your energy. There's a lot of tools and simple ways of doing that, and we would do that for anybody that's on the call today free of charge as well. Once you start getting into more complex areas of your business, like things that you purchase and transport, distribution, etc., those things can become much more complex to understand, not even just what you're measuring, but how to measure them as well to make that accurate. So that can become a challenge, and also then understanding sort of what to do and how to plan and what action you should take is often where people start needing some business, but they need some help and support rather. As I said earlier, there's a lot of information out there. If you want to try and access that help and support, we will signpost some of that later. And we are here to help. We're happy to have those initial conversations with organisations if they want to know what they can do and support on that. We do that free of charge as part of our consultancy services. So how do you go about getting to net zero? Well, really we take businesses through 4 stages essentially, and the first 2 are probably the most important that you need to do. So measuring and understanding your carbon footprint is the first point in the journey that we'd advise businesses to go through. You can't manage what you can't measure is the old adage, and it's very true in this case. So understanding where your carbon emissions are generated, how they're generated, and what you can do about that is really important. So once you've measured your footprint, what you tend to see out of that is your hotspots, the things that are driving the most carbon. For most businesses, they will be things like your energy usage, the things that you purchase, your transport, travel, distribution tend to be some of the big parts of your carbon footprint. So once you understand that, you can start then working out what you need to do. And that might be where you start to need some help and support to signpost those things that are possible within your organisation. And we would take somebody then through a reduction planning process, and that's just can be anything from a simple action plan that you could do yourself to say, I'm going to try and move to, say, renewable energy when my contract ends in 12, 18, 24 months. That would be something that you could do, and you could see quite easily from easily available tools on the web what impact that would have when you move to green energy, and effectively it removes your carbon emissions that are associated with that activity. There's other things that you might want to look at, such as if we move to electric vehicles, what happens if we stop doing something, change something. That would be part of that reduction plan, is just then understanding the current footprint, working out your timescales, working out your goals and what the impact that would have. And that would start to set you on a path towards ultimately getting to a point where you minimise and try and get rid of all of your associated carbon emissions. The next stage is really one of about communicating your actions and how you go about doing that. And for some businesses, that might just be small messages on your website, or something that you wish to put out to your customers about saying, these are the things that we are doing to be more environmentally sustainable. So that can just start with could be a simple paragraph. It could be something like a climate impact statement where you talk about the actions you're taking and the things that you're going to do. You might wish to publish your overall plan as well. You might wish to do a more detailed plan that you publish, and you might want to go for something like an accreditation or certification. And we've sort of summarised what some of those external validation and accreditation programs look like for you later on as well. The final piece is the one that we've talked about a little bit already around offsetting and the solutions to do that to then balance out your current emissions and your final hard to remove emissions within the business. So they're typically the 4 steps somebody needs to go through. Start with measure, create your plan, and that's just a simple smart action plan will suffice for that. It doesn't need to be anything. There's not a specific, I suppose, format for a net zero plan that you have to adhere to. It can just be a very simple, these are the things we're going to do, these are the timescales, this is the impact it will have. And then just thinking about how do we externalize that, how do we communicate that, how do we talk to others about it. What we see quite a lot of is, I suppose, the drivers for wanting to change, and we see 3 different camps of people that largely come to us, and then there's a 4th camp of people that aren't quite sure that this is for them as yet, really. The first camp is people that want to do something, and those people are motivated by wanting to take action and demonstrate leadership in their sector, their industry, and we seem to be doing something quite quickly. They see the value in doing that. They're often worried about maybe what's coming downstream and that there's possible regulation. They may think that there's great opportunity just to use this as a point of differentiation in things like their marketing, and just to show that they are, I suppose, true to maybe what their company values are around being a responsible business, as they might want to call it. The second camp is people who need to do something, and this is often being driven by, I suppose, increasing legislation that's coming down to bigger businesses, government, local authorities. So companies who are applying through a bid process for contracts often find that they're starting to see some form of scoring against what we would call ESG criteria, and environmental sustainability being part of that. And it is becoming an increasing scoring criteria. We know that through some of our work, some of the local authorities like Leeds, which isn't too far away, they're putting about 30% scoring on their contracts against environmental criteria. Manchester's got about 20% on ESG criteria and are looking at ways of increasing that. Some of the NHS contracts have very high scoring and different thresholds and different levels that they will measure businesses on when they apply for contract, and everyone has to demonstrate some form of environmental sustainability. We're seeing even medium-sized businesses now starting to put pressure on some of their suppliers to demonstrate that they are more sustainable, and we've got evidence of this in one of the case studies that we'll take you through later on. We also see a lot of companies starting to feel that they have to do something, and this is being really starting to come into play now with tightening regulation, and we talked about some of that as being a sort of need to do something, now moving into more of have to do something around things like NHS Net Zero. There are specific regulatory requirements for some larger businesses, and the government's now starting to tighten up on some of their frameworks around procurement. And there was a procurement notice in June of this year which stated that for large contracts, you have to demonstrate that you're measuring your carbon footprint, taking action to reduce your carbon footprint, and you have to publish that online. Our understanding is that coming out of COP, we're going to see a real tightening up of that legislation. We're going to see that apply to smaller businesses, and there's going to be a roadmap of how that is eventually going to affect all businesses. There's also talk of carbon tax, and that's something I think we'll see coming out of COP. And the price of that, we've heard anything from being £20 a tonne up to £100 a tonne. So there's a lot of pressure from some of the action groups wanting to see carbon tax being something that's levied on businesses to start hitting the highest emitters and make it more viable, financially viable for them to take action rather than just putting up with their high emissions. We also see businesses coming to us in this space where their competitors have taken action, and we are starting to see people demonstrating some leadership, which is forcing others to do something. We've got a client who we're talking to at the minute who makes type of printer. Their competitor had made a really unsubstantiated claim, saying that their product was more sustainable because of the way it worked and it was a greener product, and they saw all of their sales just dry up for that product in a very sort of short time frame. So they've had to take some action to try and respond to what their competitors are doing in the marketplace. Otherwise they just risk just losing the sales for that product. And the final one is businesses that feel they are not really part of the problem, and this can be for a few different reasons. And for some small businesses, and we could count ourselves in this really, is we have a very small carbon footprint, and therefore it is sometimes hard to make changes, hard to know what to do, and actually you may perceive that the changes you make don't have an impact, and that's not really right. We all need to do something, and it's those small changes that add up to being something bigger. For some of us, it's just really challenging running a business, and we understand that as well. We are business owners ourselves. We've worked in other organisations in leadership roles. We understand how challenging that can be to find the time. And I think a lot of people are just unsure whether they need to do something, what they can do, how difficult it is as well. So it doesn't have to be a big programme. You just need to do something. And I think that what we would sort of encourage people to do is just to take some action, and no matter how small that is really. What we are starting to see is increasing pressure, and that pressure is moving everybody towards the have to do something. So there's two things that are starting to happen here. One is that the legislation, as it filters down to smaller businesses, is starting to filter down through the supply chain. So we are starting to see more companies request information from their suppliers about their carbon footprint. I spoke to a company that does office fitting yesterday. Not a massive organisation. They do sort of shop fitting, office refits and things like that. All of their clients are starting to ask them about the carbon footprint, not just of their organisation, but of the job, because they need to measure their carbon emissions, and they need to therefore understand the impact of the work they've undertaken to do that refit as part of their mandatory carbon reporting. So it is starting to filter down, and in some cases to very small businesses where you are supplying larger businesses. So for B2B businesses, certainly becoming a have to do. If you're in a sort of B2B business, you will find that clients or your customers are more and more starting to ask about sustainable credentials, and an increasing amount of people are starting to want to understand what the sustainable credentials of the products they're purchasing are. So that's becoming a trend, and I think you only have to look at the adverts on TV to see how much sustainability is becoming just part of marketing and mainstream culture these days in a way that it wasn't pre-COVID really. So there has been a massive shift. We can see that in some of our research, and consumers are increasingly want to see businesses' sustainable credentials. The other factor is that there is legislation currently tabled that will mean by 2025 all companies will have to report their carbon emissions to Treasury. So that's the current guidance we're seeing from the government. The government are working to put those frameworks in place, but that is something that at some point in the not too distant, and I suspect that line may get a bit closer, all companies will have to do this. So the opportunity to differentiate yourself and stand out from others by being an early adopter is going to diminish quite quickly. So if you do want to try and use this to your advantage in your business and be seen to have done something, and be one of those people that have acted early and demonstrating leadership, you really need to move quite quickly, because that opportunity is going to diminish quite fast. We touched on some of the, I suppose, the pressures to do it, and the reasons why you should as well. And there's a number of factors even outside these, but often these are some of the sort of key things that we talk to organisations about. And certainly from an employee perspective, we're seeing increasing movement from certainly younger people who are expecting the businesses they work for to do the right thing by not just the planet, but by the communities they work in, and take a much more broader view of how they add value. So where it used to be around adding value to the bottom line and to shareholders, it's now becoming that triple bottom line of people, planet and profit being factors that employees want to see businesses considering. And that's also becoming an increasing factor at the other end of the scale for investors as well. So employees are increasingly looking for businesses that are doing good things and are attracted to work for companies where they can see that they can make a difference. 83% of people now coming out of COVID, unsurprisingly, after getting used to working from home, want the flexibility and productivity to be, or want to be productive anywhere. So home working has become an increasing factor for people, and that's good because it does massively reduce our carbon footprint through reduced travel and then reduced energy consumption in things like offices. From a consumer perspective, this is moving very quickly, and we did some research not too long ago where this had moved from about 65% to about 75%, and the last bit of research that we looked at that we've done ourselves is saying that 95% of people want to make sustainable or ethical purchases in the next 6 months. So people are really considering what they buy and the impact it has on the planet, and that can be seen in things like a shift in behaviour towards electric vehicles, where they're now accounting for 10% of car sales and starting to outstrip, I think they outstripped diesels for the first time a few months ago. 74% believe that ethical business practices and values are important in a reason to choose a brand. So again, it's becoming something that's really becoming mainstream, and more people are considering that as part of the purchasing. And you can see that with bigger brands starting to release more environmentally friendly brands. So I think it's Procter & Gamble, Ecover. That's a deliberate attempt by them to appeal to people that want to make those sustainable choices. From an investor perspective, we are seeing a very big shift in not just in things like private equity investment and venture capital. We've got clients coming to us saying, we currently have a loan with NatWest. We know that next year that loan's due, and they're asking us to show that we are making positive environmental impact, so that even banks like NatWest want to see that you're measuring your carbon footprint, that you're being a sustainable business, and you can show the impact you're having. So we are seeing that shift even in mainstream banking towards sustainability becoming part of what they're looking for within businesses they invest in, because they understand that's where the marketplace is shifting towards. They're also under pressure as well to measure the carbon footprint and the sustainability of their own investments. So there's new regulation just been announced that means that they are having to measure that so they can demonstrate that they are supporting businesses that are doing good things by the planet, rather than supporting maybe fossil fuel derived businesses, etc. And I suppose one of the things that's interesting is that in the markets, the indices that are supporting sustainable businesses are outperforming non-sustainable businesses last year, and we're starting to see that move quite quickly this year as well. So a couple of case studies for you. First one is a tech company. It's a company called Sumillion. They're based in Hampshire. They've got a team of 16 staff, and they provide sort of cloud-based IT solutions and IT support for businesses of all sizes, really. They've really started to embrace sustainability in the business. So when they came to us, they'd moved to being a plant-based office, as they call it. So they are vegan in food in the office. They have no meat-based products in the office. Their staff, it's part of their conscious decision-making in the recruitment process. So they look for people that are true to their values, rather than necessarily understanding the product, and then train people up to understand their marketplace, the product, and what they're doing. So it's very much a values-based business. They ban things like single-use plastic in the office. They've just shifted to a fleet of EVs, and there's a whole raft of other things that they've started to do. So they're a really good example of what you can do, and what you can do in some cases quite easily as well. And I know David at Sumillion would be really happy to talk to other businesses who wanted advice and help on things that they could do in their business as well. So when they came to us, they'd already taken some action, but what they didn't understand was the impact of that action. So they wanted to understand what impact the things that they'd done have had, and they wanted a plan to minimise their remaining emissions within the business to help them get to net zero effectively as fast as they possibly could. They also wanted some external accreditation, so they wanted to become certified so they could identify as being a carbon neutral business, and that was something that was really important to them. So we took Sumillion through a carbon footprinting audit. We then took them through the outcome of that so they could understand the overall emissions, and that's broken down into something called Scope 1, 2 and 3, and we'll talk to you about these in a minute and how that's calculated and what's within each of those scopes. We then help them understand the hotspots in the carbon audit, and we put in place a very simple carbon reduction plan because they'd already taken a lot of action. They've moved to green energy, they're doing a lot of the good things, so it was very limited what was remaining for that business, but we've helped them sort of finalise a plan which has got the last few emissions to remove. Overall, that took us really about 2 weeks worth of activity to complete from the point we onboarded them, and from the point of them signing a contract, that's a 5-week timescale. And typically for an organisation to get through a carbon footprinting process is about 4 weeks for a small business. It can be done quicker, but that allows about 2 weeks for you to obtain the information that we need to measure your footprint. And we make that really simple. It's not about having to get every receipt and every document, every bit of paper. It's just about us determining the easiest and simplest way to find the measurement points within your organisation. That can sometimes be just how much you spend on something, like maybe IT kit in this instance. You know, how much do you spend on buying things, and that we can then use that as a means of calculating carbon emissions from that level of spend. Overall, just to give you an idea of how much something like this would cost, because we touched on a barrier before, something like this is about £600 for a business of their size, and that's about £350 of the carbon footprint, and then the reduction plan and certification are £125 each. They had another business that we took through the process at the same time, so that discounted down the overall cost quite significantly as well. What they get in part of that process is they get a dashboard that they can access to see their own emissions and share externally as well. And you'll see that their carbon footprint's about 125 tonnes. We touched on the green energy bit before. They've got a carbon footprint of about 4 or 5 tonnes on their energy usage, but that then gets it gets removed from their overall carbon emissions. So we measure the carbon footprint of their energy usage, but because it's on green energy, that then comes out the final total. So there's a way of balancing that out. But that's the dashboards can include any information, I suppose, but it's a good way of you communicating externally about your impact, what you're doing, and sharing that with other people in a way that's independent and has been verified. So Sumillion linked to this through digital assets that they put on their email and website, and they have an environmental impact page that links to this dashboard as well. Sumillion are very committed to the ethical standards and sustainability within the business. I touched on some of the things that they've done, and there's a few other projects on there that they're undertaking as well, and they actually give back a percentage of their profits to charity, and they have nominated charities that they work with. Really pleased for Sumillion. They were awarded Lenovo Sustainable Partner of the Year last month, so great opportunity for them to meet Claudia Winkleman. So it looks like they're on Celebrity Come Dancing or something on the picture, but that's just them picking up their award. So they were really pleased with that. And there are increasing amounts of awards for businesses taking sustainable action. FSB does something every year, both regionally and nationally. So there's a number of different programs that, if that's something you're embracing in your business, it could be a way of getting some recognition for the work that you're doing. Another business that we work with is a company called Adept. They do these really cool vinyl wraps for commercial vehicles, and they also do signage for businesses as well. And they came to us with a bit of pressure, really, that their major competitor had approached their biggest customer, who was approximately 80% of their business, and said, look, we can do this more sustainably than Adept are currently doing. We offset our carbon footprint. Were allegedly using more sustainable materials, and Ryan and the team at Adept were concerned about this, because the client had said, look, we are embracing sustainability, and unless you can demonstrate that this is something you're doing, we feel under pressure to move to a different supplier, because we can see that it can be done in a more environmentally friendly way. So Ryan came to us with a bit of concern that if he didn't do something, he was going to lose his biggest client and then potentially his business as a result of that. So we took him through a very similar process to the one that we just talked about, Sumillion, of measuring footprint, understanding that. I suppose where the difference is with Ryan was around looking at some of the products that he was purchasing. So we did a very detailed analysis around the material that he used for wrapping vehicles, and looked at the alternatives in the marketplace, and we're able to help them measure things like wastage, because some of those products, whilst they had a lower carbon footprint, the quality of the products weren't so good, so there was higher wastage. So it was about balancing that out and understanding that, so he could talk to his client about saying, look, we have choices here, but the most environmentally friendly way, because it requires, there is less waste, is using this product, and it also is better for recycling at end of life. This also created another solution for Ryan, where when the vehicles are sold, often they're sold with the wrap and the signage still on the side, and they then just get ripped off by the new owner and largely just disposed of in a normal waste. So one of the things Ryan's looking at is how does he create a removal solution at the end for those clients who want to be more sustainable. So it's about then the vehicles coming back, they remove that to get the vehicle ready to sell, and then the actual material that's removed from the vehicle is recycled in the most eco-friendly way. Again, similar sort of time frame. Took us a little bit longer through the process with Ryan, largely just because he was busy and slow, and he delivered information to us sort of bit by bit, so it just drags that out a little bit. And that's probably one of the, I suppose, the challenges for business owners, is just how quickly you can get that information to us. Similar cost with Ryan. They offset their carbon footprint at about £500 a year as well, just to give you an idea of sort of cost around that. In terms of some of the things that they've done, this is the certificate that they get to show that they are a carbon neutral company, and they've done quite a bit of PR out, both through social media, LinkedIn, press release about being a carbon neutral business, and they're very proud of that accreditation. They retained their largest client, which is great news, and it also helped them to make an investment in a more sustainable new printer that they were looking at as well. And I touched about this on the service about removing the wrap at end of life. So there's a further commercial opportunity for Ryan and the team there, that they can charge for that service to remove the wrap and dispose of it in an environmentally friendly way. One of the things that you'll notice on the certificate and the coloured boxes there is something called the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And this is something that's often supported through offsetting activity. So it's just something that you can communicate externally to say, we're supporting projects that have some wide-ranging benefits. And typically in offsetting activity, we look for carbon credits that would support somewhere between 7 and 9 of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. We always look for projects, and we'd advise you to do the same, that have both a human benefit, so they improve lives, as well as improving the environment as well. So how do you go about reducing your own carbon footprint? Well, there's some fairly simple things you can do. We've talked about carbon footprinting and the impact you can make there. One of the things that, if people want to get an easy start on this, there are some free tools available to help you measure your scope 1 and 2 emissions. We'll do that free of charge for anybody who's on the event today. So if you're interested in that, if you just want to contact us, and we'll take you through a simple assessment process, and then we'll sort of obtain the information. We'll tell you what information we need, and we'll give you a simple calculation on your scope 1 and 2 emissions free of charge for anybody that wants to do that. Scope 3 is much more complex, and I haven't found any reliable tools online that help you calculate your scope 3 emissions free of charge, and the cost on it can vary wildly. And it varies massively for every different business. But we'll talk you through what's in scope 3 in a second, but it is something I think for most businesses would find it very difficult to measure the scope 3 emissions and do that in a robust and reliable way. We use something called GHG protocol. There's a number of different frameworks you can use for measuring your emissions. GHG we find is the most flexible, and it's probably the most recognised out of all the protocols, and it is something that's recognised at a government level, both locally and nationally, if you are looking to submit bids and tenders for any sort of contracts, whether it's with government or often with large companies as well, would recognise that. So your scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions are broken out into your direct emissions, which is things like your company facilities, your vehicles and manufacturing processes, and then your indirect, which is the purchased electricity, and in some cases, very rarely, I think we've only done one of these where they've got steam and looking at things like heating and cooling for your own use. Your indirect emissions on scope 3 cover a wide range of things, and it's anything from your employee commuting, or probably some of the more common ones for smaller businesses, business travel where you might have it, and then things like waste, transport and distribution if you are purchasing products and dispatching and sending them out, and then things like other things that you've purchased, so capital goods within the business, other goods and services. It might just be simple things like paper you're buying, IT kits, office equipment, etc. They'd be counted in there. If you're buying things that you are reselling on, we would count those as well. More common things then on the indirect emissions would be use of sold products, and then thinking about how your products are used at end of life as well sometimes. So a good example, a really simple one, we've got a craft brewery, and one of the considerations then is the beer sitting in somebody's fridge, the energy consumed as a result of that beer being in a fridge, and then what happens with things like the can at end of life, and how would that be recycled, so the emissions associated with that. So it's about trying to encourage good behaviours with your customers, with your supply chain, and you having a joint and collective responsibility with others that are consuming and using your products, or products that or services that you're purchasing from others as well. So it's about you maybe putting pressure up your supply chain or supporting your customers downstream to make good decisions. I think we touched on this quite a bit in terms of stages and steps you can go through, and so conscious of time, but very simple steps. Measure first, identify what you can control, identify the things that you want to reduce, look at the things that are reasonable that you can improve, and the actions and sensible timescales on that. And it doesn't have to be huge, somewhere between 3 and 15% is probably reasonable timescales. Estimate the carbon savings, so you'll be able to do that based on then looking at your carbon footprint, looking at the activities that you're going to undertake, and then where possible measure your results annually is good practice around a simple carbon reduction strategy. Simple things that you can do, and this is a really sort of graphical way of seeing the kind of things that you could do within a typical business. Switching to renewable energy. Some of you may have already done things like cycle to work scheme. You're probably supporting things like home working if you're an office-based business, installing LED lights, starting to think about maybe things like renewable on-site energy, or looking at switching out your fleet to EVs, or some of the simple things that for most businesses you could do. So, just simple actions, nothing overly complex. Appreciate some of those things may require capital expenditure. Some of those things aren't things that you'd be considering straight away, but they are things that could form part of your overall plan. Touched on this before, but it doesn't have to be a complicated document. It is just a simple plan, and we've got examples of these. If people want to talk to us about what a carbon reduction plan could look like, we can give you a simple template, and we've got some templates from clients who've gone through much more complex sort of climate impact statements with really then lengthy carbon reduction plans that cover every part of the business, and that's probably more appropriate for those that have got complex supply chains. Anybody who is thinking about create a carbon reduction plan, if you didn't want to do that yourself, the cost of that is typically quite low, and a simple carbon reduction plan is about £125. You may find if you're in a business that's in sort of a simple office-based business, or you've got a very simple sort of retail type business, you might find simple online guidance and templates to support you with that as well. So if it was really simple stuff, it's not the kind of thing we would charge for. We would just signpost you to where you get that information or provide that off-the-shelf help. If you want to get accredited, there's a number of different routes you can go down, and there's some of the more common ones that we see in the market are things like ISO 14001. So we have a number of clients that go through this, and that can help you to create sustainability plan. It doesn't help you to understand your carbon emissions necessarily or give you guidance on reducing them. And it does tend, my experience of what we've seen is that this is often quite generic advice rather than being specific to your business. So it'll be things like, we intend to reduce waste by doing, we intend to reduce energy consumption by doing. So there'll be some of the things that are in there. The cost of that varies depending on the size of your business. We typically see companies that have spent somewhere between £400 and £1,500 as small businesses on getting that ISO accreditation. It can be quite onerous as a business to go through that process, and I never talk to anybody who sort of particularly enjoyed doing it. It's not to say that you shouldn't, and there is value in doing that, certainly if you are looking at sort of working with larger organisations or government bodies. PAS 2060 is a means of verifying your own carbon claims, essentially, and the fact that you are a carbon neutral business and want to be a carbon neutral business. It can be very expensive to go through PAS, and you also have to go through the carbon footprinting and measurement process and have a reduction plan in place as well. So it's an additional cost rather than being an isolated cost. Good Business Charter is something that we're part of. It's no cost in your first year. It's a bit like doing a sort of slimmed down B Corp for anybody who's thinking about that. It's often a good step in that process. It has a number of criteria across other factors around how you manage people within your business, how you remunerate those people in your business, how you interact with your wider community, etc. So very low cost, free in the first year, £1 per employee afterwards. You do get access to help and support on a range of things, and you, for those that want to demonstrate that, I think it's quite a good sort of badge, if you like, to be able to put on your website, and you do become part of a wider community as well, and one that's growing quite quickly. B Corp is much more complex. It's becoming increasingly fashionable for businesses to do this. It's certainly something that we're considering in our journey. And it's generally businesses who want to be seen as a force for doing good and to become part of a wider community of businesses that are doing that. And I know those businesses are very supportive of each other. It is a legal requirement once you join. So you sign up to something that then forces you to adopt a set of rules and regulations. So it's not necessarily for every business, and it can be quite costly. It's a turnover-based charging mechanism, and it costs from $1,000 up over. So I don't know what that is on today's exchange rate, but sort of circa £800. So it can be quite expensive if you've got a sort of reasonably high turnover in your business. We use science-based targets, and they're becoming increasingly popular as a means of sort of validating your actual net zero sort of roadmap. So if you want the ultimate in sort of validation against your actions and demonstrate that they are in line with the Paris climate agreement, that will get us down to that sub 1.5 degree climate increase, you can have your targets validated against a science-based target. It's quite a new thing, not that many businesses gone through. I think there's about 700 gone through the science-based targets, but it is becoming increasingly popular, and that can be done from about £600 if that's something that you felt was appropriate to you. We touched on our accreditation. We do that from £125. You get both a physical and a digital certificate, and it requires you to have measured your carbon footprint using a recognised standard, and we use GHG protocol to do that for our clients. There are other people doing similar things to us. So, you know, in the interest of sort of being like the BBC and being very open about this, companies like Planet Mark, Avieco, Carbon Trust have comparable alternatives to us. The price point on those varies, and I think they're all around a similar level to Planet Mark, where for a small business it's about £1,500 to go through that accreditation process. I believe that includes the carbon footprinting reduction plans within that as well. I'm not going to touch on that because I think we've gone through it, other than to say we offer sort of different levels of accreditation depending on where your business is at, but it's a very similar process. These are how the sort of certificates and the dashboard looks for your business, and the digital assets that you get in that as well. So if you are looking for a means of externalizing and showing that, sharing your actions externally, this is a good way of doing it. Carbon offsets. So final things really from us are two options on this. One is around buying what we might call carbon offsets or carbon credits, and they're an effective way of just reducing your emissions on a sort of global level, of balancing out the emissions that you release by supporting projects that are happening elsewhere in the world. These tend to be in developing countries. We typically have about 45 projects across 25 developing countries on our books. Costs start at about £2.50 a tonne. It's really important to make sure that you are purchasing high quality carbon credits and that you ensure that you're buying them from a robust source where they have a reliable process of tracking those. So there are allegations of carbon credits sometimes being sold twice or not necessarily delivering the impact. So make sure that you buy from a source that's got real high levels of verification. Verra is one of the standards that we would typically look for to show that they were actually measuring that they were removing or preventing carbon entering the atmosphere from those projects. Another way of doing it is through tree planting. 10 trees will effectively sequester 1 tonne of carbon over 10 years of life. And this is a low cost way of doing it. We don't see this as being a sort of an effective means on its own. And whenever we do carbon offsetting, we double up on both of those solutions to give you the most robust way of doing it. And that would be our advice. We've had that scientifically validated as being a robust way of offsetting your carbon emissions. And final thought from me, I hope you found that useful. I appreciate it's a bit of a whirlwind. There's quite a lot of things to go through. If there's specific things people would like to talk to about, we're happy to have a one-to-one session with you. If there's questions come through, we'll do our best to answer those. I appreciate we're sort of right up to the wire on time. My final bit of advice would be that it's better to have a large number of businesses doing small things imperfectly than having a small number of larger businesses doing big things perfectly, really. I suppose it's don't worry about what you're doing and how you're doing it. We're all on this journey. We're all learning as we go. It's just about doing something and making a start, really, would be our advice to you.